Today we're going to be taking a look at what is generally considered to be one of the greatest films ever made and a personal favorite of mine. I'm speaking, of course, about Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now. This is one of those movies like Lawrence of Arabia or The Ten Commandments or uh, the original Dune movie that was really long. And growing up, we didn't have Netflix or even torrents or anything. So if you wanted to see a film like Apocalypse Now, you'd have to sit and watch it on TV. And with commercial breaks, this thing would be like 5 hours long. So I only really saw kind of snippets of it. It didn't make that much of an impression on me. I watched the original version for the first time, I think when I was 15 or 16, and it didn't really make much of an impression on me. I was just like, yeah, it's an okay movie, I guess. I didn't really get it. It's a bit like when I watched Blade Runner when I was like 15 or 16. I just thought it was kind of boring and not very interesting. I rewatched Apocalypse Now, specifically Apocalypse Now Redux, when COVID happened. I actually sat down and watched the whole movie, and I really enjoyed it. Much as with the original Blade Runner, it went from being a film I didn't really care for to that one of my all-time favorite movies. And recently, I think a year or two ago, a couple of years back, Francis Ford Coppola released yet another edition of the film, Apocalypse Now: The Final Cut. So I've been feeling like rewatching the movie for some time now, and I was just trying to figure out what cut of it to watch. I'm like, oh, there's a new one. Okay, it's been remastered for 4K. Let's give it a shot. So I have seen all three versions of the movie. We'll talk about the versions before we get into it. I personally don't think I really have a strong preference between them. Now, to talk a little bit about the background of this film before we get into it, because the background of this movie is almost as interesting as is the movie itself. So, this film was like a complete and total disaster to film. It was filmed in the Philippines. I think it took a year longer than it was supposed to take. Francis Ford Coppola ran out of funding and he had to fund it out of his own pocket. A lot of the actors hated each other. Marlon Brando was impossible to work with. From what I was able to do, and we'll talk about this a bit more maybe later, but what wound up happening is he refused to read Heart of Darkness, so he demanded that they change the name of Kurtz to something else. And then he found a copy of it and read it because he was bored. And then he's like, we have to change Kurtz's name back. And apparently, like, his scenes, he just rambled for literally hours about nothing. And they just edited the parts of him rambling to, like, the coherent, interesting bits. So Marlon Brando was terrible to work with. The set got destroyed a bunch of times. The whole thing was just kind of a mess. And it took, like, another full year or so to edit. But what came out of it was generally considered to be one of the greatest films of all time, Apocalypse Now. We're going to talk a little bit about the versions before we get into the movie itself. So if you haven't seen this film, I highly recommend you go see it, preferably before you watch my review, just because I don't really know if there's twists per se. This film has kind of a weird structure to it, but I would definitely say go watch the movie. What I'm saying will probably make a lot more sense. So there is actually four versions of this movie. There is the work print, which is circulating online in a bootleg that I'm kind of interested to watch, but it's so low quality can't really watch. And it's 5 hours long, so it's not really available though. So there's the original movie, which is 147 minutes long, which is about 2.5 hours. Now, Francis Ford Coppola eventually in 2001 created a director's cut version of Apocalypse Now with a bunch of extra footage. So the Redux version is 46 minutes longer. It contains a lot of additional content. I think a lot of just kind of the like somewhat extended scenes are okay. The two big ones are the French plantation scene and the second appearance of the Playboy Bunnies. The French plantation scene, from my understanding, is rather controversial because I can see an argument for cutting it all together because it is kind of random. But Yeah, I would say that yeah, so there's the Redux version. There is also the Final Cut. So the Final Cut is a compromise between the original version and the Redux version. I think there's some other stuff from the work print. So this is approximately 20 minutes shorter than Redux. So it's about half an hour, I guess. Yeah, about half an hour longer than the theatrical version. They have a list of the changes. Most of the changes are they cut down the French scene and they removed the Playboy bunnies, and that those are the major changes. If you haven't seen it before, I really recommend this website, Movie Censorship, where they literally will do scene by scene differences between all the different versions of the film, which is kind of cool because you saw all these like unrated things come out and you never know what it is. It's kind of neat to see what like the unrated or the director's cut actually changes because it may not even really be obvious a lot of the time. So I'd probably say like you can watch any of them. You could maybe look up somebody talking about them. I'd say the Final Cut's probably a good pick, just because it is in a it is in 4K. I think all of them are in 4K now, but I've seen a lot of debate over this, so I guess I would recommend the Final Cut. But any of them I think is pretty good. So, one more thing I guess we have to cover before we get into the movie itself is the inspiration. So, Apocalypse Now is an adaptation of Joseph Conrad's book Heart of Darkness about a about the Belgian Congo in which a I think his name's Philip Mar. Let me just look it up. Charles Marlowe, not Philip Marlowe, joins a colonial company and goes to the Belgian Congo. While there, he hears about a trader who has been making a lot of ivory in the interior of the country, the Congo Free State at the time, known as Kurtz. As he goes down the river, things get more and more weird and crazier, and you see more and more atrocities. It turns out that Kurtz has set himself up as some sort of demigod that's worshipped by the local tribe, who he has brainwashed into gathering ivory from him. He eventually dies of malaria, with his last words being the horror, the horror. Now, I was not a big fan of Heart of Darkness, despite the fact that it covers a lot of things in books that I like. I like Lost World. I like surrealism. I like it when like the hero's on a journey and the further he goes, the more reality seems to break down and becomes more abstract. And a lot of stuff like that. The big problem with Heart of Darkness to me is there's no real greater cause that Kurt seems to be serving. I think there's supposed to be maybe implied he's trying to civilize the people, and it's kind of a white man's burden thing. But I didn't really get that impression when I read it, and him just like this big thing that he just and all it really results in him is just making money through trading ivory is just kind of lame to me. Like there's no real moral ambiguity. He's just like this evil guy who manipulates people in order to make money off of the ivory trade. So I didn't like the book that much. I thought it was very overrated and not particularly good. However, they adapted it into the movie Apocalypse Now. There's another adaptation, I would say, of this in a sci-fi setting, which is Ad Astra, which I also would recommend as I enjoyed that quite a bit. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be a direct adaptation the same way that this is, but it's very similar. And it has some great cinematography, particularly when they reach Neptune. Okay, so let's start talking about Apocalypse Now. So Apocalypse Now takes place in Vietnam in 1970. At least I believe that is the year it's supposed to be. Some sources that I've seen claim it's 1968. I think 1970 makes more sense because that's closer to the end of the Vietnam War. My understanding is America withdrew from Vietnam in 1973, and so this is at the tail end of the conflict. when things are starting to wind down and America's mostly lost its faith in being able to win the war. We are introduced to our main character, Captain Willard, who's played by Martin Sheen, which is an interesting choice. It's also interesting that I believe Sheen is like 37 at the time that this film was made, and so he is kind of seems a bit old for like a special forces operator. Although part of his character is he's supposed to be a lot older and more world weary and a more experienced soldier compared to all the young draftees that he's surrounded with who don't really have any idea what they're doing. So he is obviously in the advanced stages of PTSD, wherein he has kind of become addicted to war. And as he said, whenever I'm back in the US, I wish I was here. Whenever I'm here, I wish I'm in the jungle. And he's kind of lost his ability to kind of connect and communicate with other men. And he's only really happy when he's out on a mission fighting with adrenaline, his life on the line. And we have kind of an interesting scene at the beginning of the movie where they have him waiting at a hotel in Saigon, and he gets drunk and smashes a mirror. Now, interestingly, Martin Sheen was drunk at the time and actually smashed the mirror, and his hand was actually bleeding. But like the professional is, he completed the scene, and I think Martin Sheen gave up drinking as a result of that. Like I said, this is a very personal film for a lot of the people involved in it, and the making of it sounds like it really added a lot to kind of the authenticity of the film. So he gets called in by a general and a colonel. I think he's Lieutenant Colonel. Harrison Ford's in this movie. There's a lot, like randomly, just a lot of big actors in this film. We have Martin Sheen, Marlon Brando, Robert Duvall, um, Lawrence Fishburne, Dennis Hopper, uh, I think a number of other people. Um, Obviously, he knew some of these people from the making Godfather. But he's invited in. Willard is given a briefing by the military who tell him that he has to terminate the command of Colonel Kurtz with extreme prejudice. And so, as we go through the film, they give Willard a bit of background into Kurtz. But as we kind of go through different acts of the story, Willard spends a lot of the time on the boat reading through his biography. So, the complete kind of picture of Kurtz we see is that at one point in time, he was a deeply moral man. They call him a humanitarian. Um, he was one of the most successful decorated soldiers in the history of the U.S. Army. He was on track to become chief of staff to the whatever the general staff. He was going to basically get the highest position in the U.S. Army, or just become a full general, maybe become one of the commanding officers of Vietnam. This guy was basically a limit between his personal charisma and talents. He was going places. Now he went on a trip to Vietnam where it was I think an observational command, and he came back and he issued a report stating that well, we don't know what the contents of the report is, but it was suppressed. After the report was suppressed, he petitioned to leave his role in staff and go and join the airborne. It took him a couple of tries, but he succeeded in getting through the airborne school and became special forces at the age of 38, whereas most people who go through that are like 17 or 18. It's unheard of for someone that old to go through it. I don't know if that's really in real life. I'd imagine it is in real life. But the film portrays it as something that's basically impossible. When he comes back to Vietnam, he takes a very interesting kind of different way of looking at it. He becomes an advocate for total war. He says that the U.S. cannot win this war because they're not committed to victory. They don't want victory. That this is just kind of a bizarre sideshow, and it doesn't really matter. The metaphor he uses is that he has a dream about a snail crawling across a razor blade, wherein the US is playing around with fire and all this stuff, but ultimately it's not really going to get that badly hurt. Maybe a couple of tens of thousands of young men will die. Maybe the country will lose some money. But ultimately, the success or failure of Vietnam doesn't really impact the U.S. in a meaningful way. Now, I'm not sure how many Americans Kurtz has serving him, but what he wound up doing was going deep into the jungles. I think it's in Cambodia, or at least it's along the Cambodian border. And he succeeded in getting together an army of Montagnards. Now, my understanding is the Montagnards are a indigenous people in Vietnam, and they're a separate ethnic group from the Vietnamese. They're a relatively small percentage of the population. I think today the Montagnards are only about 2.2 million. They were disproportionately Christian, and they were heavily recruited by the southern Vietnamese government because they were hostile to communism and fears that their autonomy would be destroyed if the northern Vietnamese were to win the Civil War. So Kurtz has he took his American command, Special Forces, recruited a bunch of Montagnards, and he has basically made himself into a pagan deity, into a demigod who's worshipped by them. And he's just started to wage a brutal guerrilla warfare, which involves just massacring entire villages, just showing up. Basically, the North Vietnamese are just terrified of him. They think he's some sort of a demon, and he's being extremely successful. Part of the problem that military command has with him is that he is so successful, that he's completely abandoned their like weak hearts and minds. We're going to kind of fight this war, kind of not fight this war thing. And he's just like, you can't be a pussy about it. If we're going to win this war, if we're here to defeat communism, if we're here to win, we're here to win. And there's no sugarcoating it. There's no making this war like something nice and fluffy, and no one gets hurt or no one gets killed. This is war, and men die in war. And Kurtz very much takes that perspective, kind of, I guess, as a result of extreme PTSD. He talks about it more once we see him. The problem and why he's in trouble is he killed a number of Viet Cong double agents. Now, these double agents he killed were South Vietnamese government officials. Now, were they actually double agents? Yeah, probably. He spent months gathering what was basically referred to as indisputable evidence that these two guys were infiltrators who were feeding information to the Viet Cong. However, the South Vietnamese government, because it's the South Vietnamese government post Diem, is super corrupt, and they don't like the fact that Kurtz is running around like having success, that he's taking justice into his own hands. So he has to be executed for murder. Now, obviously, executing someone for murder or charging someone with murder during a war like this, especially when he was targeting legitimate targets, which was spies being sent by the enemy they're at war with, is kind of absurd. And Willard, very early on, I don't know if it's fair to say he sympathizes with Kurtz, but he does kind of get where he's coming from a bit. There is a lot of obvious parallels between the two. They were both in their late 30s. They both have severe PTSD. They're both special forces. They've both become disgusted by the hypocrisy, the unwillingness of the U.S. Army to try to win the war. And we do see, as the film goes on, Willard increasingly becoming kind of a mirror image of Kurtz, albeit without maybe his charisma. And one ending of this film, which unfortunately didn't happen, and I think might have actually probably been a better one, is that Willard becomes the next Kurtz, and he takes over as the leader of the Montagnard army and continues to fight the war on his own terms, following in his predecessor's example. Instead, there's supposed to be kind of a divergence between the two men, where ultimately Willard chooses to side with his humanity and honor as a soldier, and doesn't completely go off the plantation the same way Kurtz did. It's interesting because they sent another special forces captain before Willard who defected and joined Kurtz. And so before we get more into the plot, let's just talk a bit about Kurtz and what the film is trying to say. One of the big messages of the film, and this is something that Kurtz really embodies, is the idea that the US really has no desire to win in Vietnam. That what it would take to actually win the war, to defeat the North Vietnamese, would be so brutal or so excessive or require them to sacrifice too much of their humanity that they're not able to do so, and that it is for a lot of them, in essence, like just going on a vacation. I mean, obviously, it's a horrendous experience, but Willard points out that the way the rotation system works, people are there for like a couple months up to a year. They get transferred back to the states and they come back. There's not necessarily the time to really build up a permanent army that has good coordination and that's capable of winning. They're just constantly kind of shuffling new soldiers through, and it just organizationally doesn't make a lot of sense. He also comments that there's been too much of an effort to try to make Vietnam resemble normal American life, like with steaks, barbecues, uh, like USO shows, just how they've tried to set up some of the cities that they're garrisoning, and it prevents people from really getting adjusted and getting the kind of basic brutality that's necessary in order to actually fight and win the war. There's also the whole contrast wherein the U.S. soldiers are portrayed in a lot of cases as being uncaring, brutal, and indifferent to the suffering of the Vietnamese people. But at the same time, they aren't willing, once again, to go far enough to actually win the war. And so we have this stalemate that's caused by one side having the ability to win but unwilling to win, and it just kind of drags on and on. I don't think the US really ever had a plan to win the Vietnamese war. I mean, I don't really understand, especially post Diem. Perhaps before they killed Diem, they could have defeated the Viet Cong, set Diem's regime up so it was strong enough to take care of itself, and then provided some monetary support and maybe some air power. Post Diem, there was functionally not really an effective Southern Vietnamese government, so it was just kind of a completely like pointless endeavor to keep the war going. And once again, the point I think Kurtz is trying to make is if we're here, if we're gonna keep doing this bullshit, like we're gonna keep just blowing up random villages and we're gonna do this like hearts and minds propaganda and it's all just really fake and G slur. Screw that, let's just go all out. Let's go full balls to the wall, let's kill every single Viet Cong, let's burn all their villages down, let's kill anyone who sympathizes with them, and we're gonna get it done. And this is kind of the thing, and this is kind of the question of, is it better to have a more brutal war that's over quicker, where one side actually wins, or is a low intensity conflict better? Is it better to have 30,000 men die in 1 year, or 50,000 men die over 10 years? And in one case, all the destruction happens at once, and then you can rebuild, versus continual destruction, and it becomes kind of a generational thing. So the argument I think can be made, and this is something you often will see in war, that just going in and winning overwhelmingly at the beginning, even if it involves blowing everything back to the Stone Age, is preferable to a long drawn out conflict. This is kind of when you get into the whole Sun Tzu win without fighting thing. The problem with winning without fighting and relying on maneuver warfare is it can devastate the countryside, it can result in pandemics, economic collapses, and it can often be even more devastating than just having big conventional battles in terms of its overall societal impact. So I say the movie on all does portray Kurtz as being a monster, but at the same time he's at least not a hypocrite. The US Army soldiers and generals you see might not be as personally evil as Kurtz is, but Kurtz is respectable in that he's willing to get his hands dirty, he's willing to do what it takes to win, and he's not being hypocritical about it. Like, there's a scene in the film where the people on the PT boat just freak out and they shoot a bunch of Vietnamese civilians. And there's one woman who's left who's like who's badly wounded. And they're like, oh, we have to take her to a hospital. And Willard just shoots her. And he's like, look, you guys wanted to kill them. Let's just move on. Like, enough of this, like, fake stuff where we gun them down and then we take them to a hospital, or we, like, napalm the village and then we put band-aids on people. The whole thing is just kind of a joke. So Willard meets up with a patrol boat who's going to take him into Cambodia so that he can kill Colonel Kurtz. At this point in time, he's still fully on board with killing Kurtz, thinking that he's gone insane. Now, to get into the mouth of the river, he has to team up with Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore, played by Dennis Hopper. Now, he's undoubtedly supposed to be, I think, one of the villains of the movie. He's supposed to represent the evil, ugly American who doesn't care about civilian casualties, who's 100% convinced of his own righteousness, who's trying to impose his culture on the Vietnamese, and stuff like that. If you look a bit deeper, though, at Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore, I think it's interesting that Willard says about him that despite all his flaws, he's still a good officer, in that he legitimately does love his men and cares for them. I always like the trope of father to his men. So is he like a good person? No. But he does everything he can to make sure that his boys have like all the weapons they need, that they get medical care. He brings in T-bone steaks and beer for them. He just does whatever it takes to try to make the war better for his boys. And that's, I think, if nothing else, you can respect that in a commander who does care for his men. And that often will pay massive dividends when it comes to combat, because men who love their commander will willingly die for them. So he's initially not willing to help them out, but it turns out a member of the patrol boat, Lance, is a famous surfer. Kilgore is a massive fan of surfing, and he manages to figure out, he's like, you know what? The mouth of the river would have really good waves. So this brings us to the iconic scene in which the air cavalry attack a Viet Cong village to ride up the Valkyries. And we get one of the greatest action scenes in cinema, where the air cavalry just come in and just blow everything up. You have the North Vietnamese shooting back. You have ground fights. You have rockets. It's just a lot of fun. You eventually have an airstrike that comes in, and we get the famous line, "I love the smell of napalm in the morning." And there's a scene that added into Redux where Kilgore saves the life of a Vietnamese child, or Vietnamese baby. A lot of people complained about this because it made him slightly more human looking instead of a complete monster. Um, I like that because I think to a certain extent this film is kind of, I'd say it's almost something like Paths of Glory in a sense, where it's more just a general anti-war movie in the sense where it tries to portray the horrific impacts of it and the things that it drives men to do, rather than be a specific condemnation of American imperialism or American colonialism. I mean, maybe that was the purpose, and maybe I'm just reading too much into it. But like Paths of Glory, which is another movie I really like, isn't really about politics or anything. It's just about the struggles that happen during a war, when you have to deal with bad officers, when you have to deal with men's individual egos, and the moral quandaries that come with dealing with that, and more so than about any particular justice or rightness of the war. So I think that makes sense. Like, are all these like arrogant Americans, are they really like bad people? Are they sociopaths who just came there to kill? Or are a lot of them just kids who weren't properly trained for this and just kind of got sent overseas to this poorly run war? No one really knows what's going on. They're getting all these conflicting instructions. We're here for hearts and minds, but we're going to take zero risks and just blow everything up with bombs and machine guns and Agent Orange and stuff like that. And that they're more just kind of lost and confused, and both them and the Vietnamese and the Viet Cong are stuck in this cycle of ending bloodshed and just attempting to kill one another and get revenge. And it's kind of broken down beyond any real ideological or national interests into just kind of a very base us versus them mentality. So they manage to get away from Kilgore after he blows the village up, and they start going down the river. And this is, I think, where you can argue the film really begins. As they go down the river, things get more and more surreal. Things get crazier and crazier. They run into a tiger. They run into a one army base where they're having a USO show where a group of Playboy bunnies come out and do like a sexy dance for the men there. The men wind up storming the stage and they have to evacuate the bunnies by a helicopter. It's interesting because in the Redux version, the bunnies show up again later on in like some deserted camp further north, but in this one, they just kind of disappear. So we have stuff like that happen. There's like a boat that they pull over. When they reach the last outpost, the thing's just under attack, although you can't really see the Viet Cong attacking it. There's no commanding officer. It's just in a state of constant chaos. They aren't even really able to figure anything out, so then they go. And that is the last American outpost, and beyond that, there's just the Viet Cong and Kurds. However, it's apparently not just the Viet Cong and Kurds. Maybe I'm getting the order of events happy because it's a very episodic movie. But they come across in the Redux and Final Cut version a French plantation. There's still some French colonists who refuse to leave, and they put together their own militia of French settlers. There probably are a couple Americans and some locals who have decided to throw in with them. So they help the Americans fix up their boat, and they let them stay overnight. The head of the French family does a big rant about how like the French government is incompetent, how they gave up on Vietnam, they gave up on Algeria, they gave up on like all of the French Empire, but he's not going to give up here. This is his land. He's not leaving. His family's been here for multiple generations. I forget if it was Mitterrand or who was president of France at the time, but there was some like socialist president, and the dude's like the guys the French guys like, why are we here fighting? Why are you guys here fighting this war if your countries are run by communists? Like in Britain, you have the Labour Party, you have the Socialist Party in France, you have the Communist Party in Italy, literally being the second largest party in the country. You're being run by communists who are destroying your society by injecting it with communist ideas. Why are you even here? What is your like actual beef with the Soviets? He's like, I'm fighting for my home. You Americans are fighting for the stupidest shit in world history. Like, why are you even here? Um, and it kind of that kind of just goes, and then they yeah. So then they the French part is a very controversial because I don't know if it really adds anything. It's not like it's a bad scene, but it is kind of like a random side trip in a digression that's not really needed in the film that's as long as it is. I still, as someone who likes the film, I'm always happy to see more footage from it. So I don't really mind. Like if a version of Blade Runner 2049 came out that had like an extra hour of deleted scenes, I would watch that. So that happens. Now we get to kind of the final arc of the movie. A lot of the crew is dead by this point in time or has gone insane, and they're reaching the area that is controlled directly by Kurtz with his Montagnard army. So once we get there, we find that Kurtz has set himself up in a old Kamer temple as a godlike figure, and he has trained his men to just operate in an extremely brutal fashion. Once you get there, so apparently in original cut of the film, not that the theatrical cut and the work print cut, they had just repelled a Viet Cong counterattack, which is not explained in the current version of the movie. But basically, there is just huge numbers of bodies hanging everywhere, skulls. It looks like something from Apocalypto or some kind of like Aztec collapse movie. The kind of environment that has been created. And Willard comes there and they tie him up and kind of torture him and stuff for a lengthy period of time to kind of break him. And eventually, Lance, who's the surfer guy, is still alive, and he gets assimilated into the tribe and begins to worship Kurtz as well. Robert Duvall is there in the form of a American journalist who gives just a lot of more background on stuff that Kurtz has been doing. And Chef, who's the only other person who's left, gets killed when he tries to call in an airstrike on um, Kurtz's compound. Eventually, we get Willard to come to face with Kurtz, and they finally meet. Now, Marlon Brando was supposed to be like skinny because he's dying of malaria. He's immensely obese, so they have to like film it from like the waist or from like the shoulders up, and they have to put him in the dark and all this other stuff. And I think it actually does work to make his character seem more like supernatural and intimidating. But at the same time, it is pretty funny. So it starts out with him talking to Kurtz, and Kurtz says, "Oh, you're just an errand boy. They sent you here. You don't even know why you're here. You just do whatever they tell you to do. You're bound by the petty morality of a bunch of like losers who have never seen combat, who are just pushing papers around, um, who don't really care about winning this war, and everything's just falling apart everywhere, and they don't care." And he's like, "I'm out here actually trying to win this war." And that's kind of their first meeting. And then we get to kind of the really iconic scene where he does the speech about horror. So Kurtz is explaining why he became the way he is, why he snapped, why he just became so brutal, so horrific, why he decided to make himself into a godlike figure. And he tells this story of when he was serving in special forces and they were doing the Hearts and Minds campaign, and they went to a village and they inoculated all the children there for polio. The Viet Cong later came by and chopped off all the polio, the injected arms from the children who had gotten it as a sign to not work with the Americans. And Kurtz was extremely impressed with this. So he said, like, the sheer act of will for these guys who are trained soldiers to be able to do something like that. To not just go insane and destroy the village, but to do such calculated cruelty of going in, cutting off the inoculated arms to send a message. He's just like, they're stronger than us. We don't have the will to do anything like that. That's what it takes to win this war. The command back home just has no idea what the fuck they're doing. These guys know what they're doing. Even if they don't have the weapon systems, they're eventually going to win. The only way that we can beat them is if we become as bad as them, if we become as amoral as them. We throw away the hypocrisy of blowing a village up and then giving a band-aid to the people that we burned. We're just going to win this war. And he says, if I had 10 divisions of men like that, this war would be over very quickly. There's some other interesting stuff he says, like about how judgment is what destroys people, judging themselves and the fear of judgment. The speech is all about how you have to make a friend of horror. His last words, as with the Kurtz in the book Heart of Darkness, are the horror, the horror. Eventually, what it kind of obviously comes out to be is that Kurtz is dying of malaria and he wants Willard to kill him. There's a couple different reasons for this. A, he's just dying of malaria and it's an extremely unpleasant death, and he'd rather just die in a quicker, more painless way. Also, he's a soldier and he wants to die a soldier's death. He wants to die on his feet, killed by a man that he respects, rather than just dying in his bed, withering away from malaria. Um, Kind of the same principle for like how captured army off. Like if soldiers are being executed, they have a right to die by firing squad because they're dying on their feet, facing their enemy in battle, as opposed to just being hung like a common criminal. Also, Kurtz sees, I think, a lot of himself in Willard, and his hope is that Willard will take over for him, that he will become the next leader of the Montagnard army, that he's a man of a similar background with similar ideals, that he's also a man of action, and that he will continue the war and eventually win the war on Kurtz's behalf. And we have a very explicit scene, which is, I think, actually happened, where these the Montagnards, although I think they're actually Filipinos, slaughter a water buffalo, and they just cut it up, and it's pretty horrific. Like I think they cut it up while it's still alive, and that's intercut with Willard killing uh, Kurtz with a machete. Although that scene's kind of poorly filmed, it's supposed to kind of resemble it. Once again, the issue is that Marlon Brando was just so fat when this was filmed. They had to use some really kind of dodgy camera work to avoid showing his bulk. After he kills Kurt's final words are the horror, the horror. It looks briefly like Willard is going to sit down at Kurt's desk and kind of take up the work that Kurtz did and continue from where he left off. He ultimately, though, chooses to not follow in Kurtz's footsteps to kind of maintain his humanity and maintain his loyalty to the U.S. Army, and that's more important to him than just purely winning. And he doesn't want to embrace kind of the darkness and nihilism within himself. And so he winds up just taking Lance and leave. All of the Montagnards like bow to worship him because he killed their god. They're willing to follow him to whatever end. He could become the next Kurtz. He could lead the army. He could even maybe win the Vietnam War. But ultimately, he just said somebody has to stop the cycle of violence. Someone has to stop just justifying the means by the justifying the means by the ends. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of the ending. I think the ending was like okay. I think it would have made more sense if he had to become Kurtz. I think Francis Ford Coppola was trying to be more positive with his ending and saying that like humanity can overcome its base instincts, that humanity can become better, that we can choose to forgive, that we can choose to love and not hate. I don't. I kind of gonna press an X to doubt on that one in a lot of cases. Also, I just think thematically, Willard is so similar to Kurtz that it would have made sense for him to take over in the Kurtz's position. So, what can be said for Apocalypse Now? It is a beautifully made film with some of the best cinematography I've ever seen. It has a very interesting, dreamlike quality, very surreal, but also really tries to say a lot about human nature, about what war does to people, and just a lot of questions like, do the ends justify the means? Is a half measure worse than a full measure if the half measure is going to cause more harm overall? We have some great acting from Martin Sheen, obviously Marlon Brando. Just an overall excellent film. I tried to cover what I could, but given that the movie's like 3 hours, 4 hours long, it's kind of hard to really cover all of it. But I think that's ultimately what it is. I don't really see Kurtz as a nihilist so much as a someone who was an idealist, someone who was a decent man, and just doesn't know what to do anymore. And in kind of his despair and his sorrow, much like Dracula, he drank up the sorrows of his homeland and became a demon in order to try to win the war. But I actually probably sympathize more with Kurtz than a lot of people do. He is like not a good person. He's a horrible person.